Sometime in the early 1980s, a Japanese engineer named Akira Araki stood on a bridge over the Mississippi River and watched two motorcycles launch from one end toward the other. It was illegal, it was loud, and the finish line was the opposite bank. Araki would later recall that the image planted itself and would not leave. Two machines, a fixed distance, and nothing that mattered except who reached the far side first. That idea would become the most violent production motorcycle of its decade. A machine so committed to straight-line acceleration that it could not even carry its fuel tank in the place where every other motorcycle on Earth carried one. The fuel sat beneath the seat, hidden, because every cubic inch above the engine had been surrendered to the system that made the whole thing possible. The motorcycle was the Yamaha VMAX, and the engine inside it was never supposed to be fast. You're watching Machine Documentary, where we take apart the machines and the decisions that built them, down to the butterfly valve and the engineer who opened it. If a V4 engine stolen from a touring bike and turned into a quarter-mile weapon sounds like your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the rise here is just as strange as what came after. To understand why the VMAX existed, you have to understand what Yamaha was before it built motorcycles. The company that would create the most single-minded muscle bike in history began as a manufacturer of reed organs and pianos. Nippon Gaki, founded in 1887, spent its first 6 decades making musical instruments. When Junichi Kawakami, the company's chairman, looked at the idle machining equipment left over from wartime production and decided to build motorcycles, he was not following a passion for speed. He was filling a factory. In 1955, Yamaha Motor Company was formally separated from the parent company, and its first product was the YA1, a 125 cubic centimeter two-stroke single-cylinder machine that was, by honest admission, a copy of the German DKW RT 125. It won its class at the Mount Fuji Ascent Race that same year, and a company that knew how to tune a piano began learning how to tune an engine. By the early 1980s, the learning was long finished and the fighting had begun. Honda's CB750 had rewritten the rules of production motorcycling in 1969, and through the 1970s and into the 80s, the Japanese manufacturers waged an escalating horsepower war across every segment. In 1982, Honda launched the V4 engine platform with the V45 Sabre and followed it a year later with the V65 Magna, a 1,100 cubic centimeter muscle cruiser that made over 100 horsepower and ran the quarter mile in the low 11s. Suzuki answered with the V4 Madura. Kawasaki modified its inline-4 into the Eliminator. The power cruiser category was born, and every manufacturer in Japan was fighting for the same stretch of asphalt. Yamaha had inline-4 sport bikes and V-twin cruisers, but in this new and violent segment, it had nothing. What it did have, sitting in a completely different corner of its lineup, was a V4 engine. The wrong engine, in the wrong motorcycle, for the wrong purpose, but it was a V4. The engine lived inside the Venture Royale. Introduced in 1983, the Yamaha Venture Royale was a full-dress touring motorcycle built to cross the American interstate in comfort. It carried a 1,198 cubic centimeter liquid-cooled V4, double overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, producing 95 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. It weighed 325 kilograms wet. That is 717 pounds. It had an AM/FM cassette stereo, electronically controlled air suspension, a full frame mounted fairing, and enough luggage capacity for 2 riders and a long weekend. It was civilized, quiet, and staggeringly heavy. It was also, in the eyes of Akira Araki's team, the starting point for the fastest production motorcycle in the world. Araki and 2 engineers were sent to GK Design International Studio in Santa Monica, California. They spent 30 days there, and the brief was simple: build the American hot rod on 2 wheels. The design language drew from Detroit muscle cars and American drag strips. Chrome air scoops flanked a dummy fuel tank that held nothing but the motorcycle's horns. The actual fuel, 4 gallons of it, was hidden beneath the seat beneath a pivoting hard plastic cover, because the space above the engine had to be given entirely to the airbox that fed the intake system. The rear tire was a 150-section Bridgestone, the widest ever fitted to a production motorcycle at its introduction. Every visual cue screamed American V8, but the heart was a Japanese V4, and 95 horsepower from a touring engine was not enough, not even close. The obvious solution in 1983 was turbocharging. Honda had the CX 500 Turbo. Kawasaki had the GPZ 750 Turbo. Suzuki had the XN85 Turbo. The technology was proven, it was fashionable, and it promised the kind of headline numbers that sold magazines. But turbocharged motorcycles had a problem that turbocharged cars did not. Turbo lag on 2 wheels was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. A sudden surge of power arriving mid-corner or mid-lean on a machine that weighed less than a quarter of a car could send a rider into the scenery. Araki's engineers took a different path. They started with the Venture Royale's bottom end and rebuilt the top. Intake valves were enlarged from 29 millimeters to 30.5. Exhaust valves went from 25 to 26. The 4 Mikuni carburetors were widened from 34 millimeters to 35. Valve stem diameters were reduced to improve airflow. Hotter camshafts were fitted for stronger mid-range. The engine internals were strengthened to handle the additional stress. But these were refinements. The real breakthrough was the system that gave the VMAX its character, its reputation, and eventually its name in the history of motorcycling. Yamaha called it V-Boost. The V-Boost system used butterfly valves mounted in the intake manifold between paired cylinders. Below 6,000 revolutions per minute, the valves stayed closed. Each cylinder drew air and fuel from its own single Mikuni carburetor, and the engine behaved like a well-mannered, torquey V4, idling with the kind of lumpy, low-frequency pulse that reminded riders of a 1960s American V8. Then the tachometer needle crossed 6,000. A servo motor, triggered by the ignition signal, began opening the butterfly valves. By 8,000 revolutions per minute, the valves were fully open, and each cylinder was drawing from 2 carburetors simultaneously, its own and its paired neighbors. The effect was a mechanical supercharge, double the intake volume, a surge of additional fuel and air, without the lag, the heat, the plumbing, or the expense of a turbocharger. Yamaha claimed the system added 10% to the peak power of the base engine. The modified V4 now claimed 145 horsepower at the crankshaft, 120 at the rear wheel. In 1984, that number did not merely lead the muscle cruiser class. It embarrassed most racing motorcycles. What happened next would decide whether the most eccentric motorcycle Yamaha had ever conceived would reach a single showroom floor. In October 1984, Yamaha unveiled the VMAX at a dealer meeting in Las Vegas. Inside the company, there had been doubt. Araki himself would later admit that the styling was too eccentric and that nobody knew how to react. The dummy fuel tank with its decorative chrome air scoops housing nothing but the horns, the actual fuel tank buried beneath the seat, the angular squared-off headlight nacelle, the wide, low stance that owed more to a Pontiac than to anything rolling out of Iwata. It was a motorcycle designed in California by Japanese engineers channeling American drag culture, and it looked like nothing else in any dealership in the world. The dealers loved it. The VMAX hit showrooms in 1985 with a manufacturer's suggested retail price of $5,299, roughly $2,000 more than Honda's V65 Magna. Cycle Guide named it Bike of the Year. Cycle World, in a review that has been quoted for 4 decades, called it about as subtle as a whack across the forehead with a running chainsaw. The same magazine tested it at 10.6, 2 seconds in the quarter mile at 129.87 miles per hour, ridden by Dale Walker at 170 pounds with the mirrors still attached. In pre-production testing, a lighter rider named Jay Gleason had run a 10.30. The VMAX was the fastest production motorcycle in the world. According to one widely repeated industry account, some dealers sold them for cash only, on the theory that buyers might crash before the loan payments cleared. Whether that story is verified fact or affectionate myth depends on whom you ask, but it tells you how the machine was received. Not every rider who twisted the throttle past the V-boost threshold was ready for what arrived. The VMAX earned a reputation among emergency rooms and insurance underwriters that other motorcycles of its era did not. And the restraint in telling that part of the story is that the machine never pretended to be anything other than what it was. The riders knew. Some of them paid. The pivot that created the VMAX was not simply the V-boost system, or the Venture Royale engine, or the styling drawn from drag strips. It was the decision to build a motorcycle that did one thing and refused to apologize for everything it could not do. The VMAX cornered poorly. The steel cradle frame flexed under hard acceleration. The 40mm Kayaba forks were too soft for the weight. The front brake calipers, two piston units borrowed from the lightweight RD350, demanded serious pressure to slow 271 kilograms of dry weight. The fuel tank held 4 gallons, which at the VMAX's thirst of roughly 30 miles per gallon meant a range of barely over 100 miles before you were walking. None of this was accidental. Yamaha had made a choice. The straight line mattered more than anything, and everything that did not serve the straight line was allowed to be merely adequate. That choice, the absolute refusal to compromise, is what made the VMAX a phenomenon. It would also, in time, define the limits of what the VMAX could become. By 1986, every competitor in the muscle bike category was retreating. Honda's V65 Magna was discontinued. Suzuki pulled the Madura after 3 production years. Kawasaki's Eliminator was abandoned. The VMAX owned a segment it had effectively killed by being too dominant to justify the fight. But the American motorcycle market was contracting. A recession thinned the buyer pool, and unsold 1985 and 1986 VMAXs sat on dealer floors. Yamaha's response was blunt. There was no 1987 VMAX. The company simply skipped the model year and waited for the inventory to clear. In 1988, the VMAX returned with new wheels and an electronic ignition upgrade. But the engine, the frame, the V-boost system, the hidden fuel tank, and the fundamental character of the motorcycle were untouched. They would remain untouched for the next 2 decades. The superbike revolution erupted around it. Suzuki launched the GSXR 750 in 1985. Honda introduced the CBR 900RR Fireblade in 1992. Top speed wars, aerodynamic fairings, aluminum beam frames, and 6-speed gearboxes consumed the industry's attention and engineering budgets. The VMAX did not care. It was not built for corners, not built for top speed, not built for track days. It was built for the first 300 feet, the launch, the shove in the chest, the straight line from here to the vanishing point. While the rest of the industry chased lean angles and wind tunnel data, the VMAX sat in showrooms with the same steel frame, the same hidden fuel tank, the same V-boost servo clicking open at 6,000 RPM, and sold. Year after year after year, Yamaha touched it twice in 23 years. In 1993, the forks were thickened to 43 millimeters and the brakes upgraded to 4-piston calipers, addressing the 2 most persistent complaints. In 1996, the oil filtration system was improved. That was it. In an industry where flagship motorcycles are redesigned every 3 to 4 years, the VMAX went 23 with its DNA intact. That kind of stasis is either laziness or faith, and the answer depends on what you believe about the machine. What the VMAX earned through those years of refusal to change was something that no engineering update and no press release could have manufactured. It earned riders who did not merely like the motorcycle, they carried it. By most accounts, Yamaha sold roughly 100,000 first-generation VMAXs worldwide before the replacement arrived. Owners' clubs formed from France to Japan to Australia. Online forums, VMX Forum and VMX Chat, and V4 Musclebike Forum became registries of serial numbers, troubleshooting archives, and gathering places for the kind of rider who measured a motorcycle not by its lap time around a circuit, but by what it did to the base of your spine in the first 3 seconds of throttle. The machine that earned that loyalty deserves a closer look. The first generation VMX 1200 carried a 1,198 cubic centimeter, 70-degree V4, double overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, liquid-cooled. At idle, it burbled with a low-frequency pulse that sounded nothing like the screaming inline fours dominating the sport bike world. Riders compared it to the idle of a small-block Chevrolet, a lumpy, syncopated rumble that vibrated through the handlebars and into the palms. The gearbox was a 5-speed, delivering power through a shafted drive rather than a chain, because the torque was relentless and constant, and a chain would have demanded more maintenance than the VMAX's owners wanted to give. The throttle at low RPM was crisp and manageable, a big V4 loafing through city traffic with surprising civility. Then you crossed 6,000 RPM, and the VMAX became a different motorcycle. The V-boost servo clicked, the butterfly valves opened, the paired Mikuni carburetors linked across the intake manifold, and each cylinder began drinking from 2 throats instead of 1. The power did not arrive gradually. It arrived like a hand shoving you in the chest. Cycle World, testing the original, wrote that it had power everywhere. Off the bottom, it's torquier than a Honda Goldwing. On top, it hits harder than a Kawasaki 900 Ninja. And from the bottom to the top, the power band is broader than that of a BMW K100S. That is not a review. That is a confession. The rear tire, that 150-section Bridgestone, the widest fitted to any production motorcycle when the VMAX debuted, laid black stripes from a standstill. The chassis was honest about what it was and what it was not. A tubular steel cradle frame with 40mm Kayaba forks and twin rear shocks, it flexed under hard acceleration. The front end could develop a wobble at high speed that focused the attention. The front brake calipers, 2 piston units sized for a bike half the VMAX's weight, demanded deliberate, planned braking rather than last-second panic stops. At 271 kilograms dry, nearly 620 pounds with fuel in that hidden tank, the VMAX was not a machine that forgave laziness or rewarded timidity. None of it mattered to the people who bought them. Riders do not pay 5,000 to 7,000 British pounds for a 30-year-old motorcycle with known frame flex and marginal brakes because they read a favorable review. They pay it because the machine did something to them that nothing else has done since. The first time the V-boost opened, the first time the horizon started pulling forward instead of sitting still, was the moment the VMAX stopped being a motorcycle and became a memory that riders carried for the rest of their lives. 23 years after the original, Yamaha finally tried to build a successor worthy of that memory. Development of the second-generation VMAX began in 2003, and the engineers started from nothing. No carryover parts, no shared platform, no cost-cutting shortcuts borrowed from the touring division. The new engine displaced 1,679 cubic centimeters from a 65-degree OVE4, producing 200 PS, roughly 197 brake horsepower, at 9,000 revolutions per minute, and 123 pound-feet of torque at 6,500 revolutions per minute. The mechanical V-boost was gone, replaced by YCCI Yamaha chip-controlled intake. a system of servo-activated variable-length intake trumpets managed by an onboard computer, fly-by-wire throttle, fuel injection, a slipper clutch, 6-piston radial mount brake calipers with ABS. The frame was cast aluminum, with the engine serving as a stressed structural member. The suspension was fully adjustable at both ends, a concept the original never entertained. The fuel tank was still beneath the seat, because some traditions are load-bearing, but it now held only 3.3 gallons. The 2009 VMAX launched at $17,990, more than triple the price of the 1985 original. It ran the quarter mile in the low 10 seconds, marginally faster than its predecessor, but not by the margin that 200 PS promised over 145. The reason was weight. The Gen 2 VMAX weighed 310 kilograms wet. More than the original. More than most sport touring motorcycles. It was faster, safer, more technologically advanced, and more capable in corners than the machine it replaced. But it arrived into a world that had already figured out how to build fast motorcycles without sacrificing everything else. And in 2011, Ducati proved it. The Diavel made 162 horsepower, weighed less, cost less, handled better, and looked like it belonged in the present tense rather than honoring the past. The category the VMAX had created in 1985 now had a competitor that understood something Yamaha never quite accepted. The world wanted the theater of raw power without paying the full price of admission. The Diavel was not the VMAX's executioner. The executioner was quieter, written in regulation, and measured in grams per kilometer. Euro 4 emissions regulations took effect across Europe in January 2017. The rules demanded catalytic converter efficiency, onboard diagnostic systems, noise limits, and evaporative emissions controls that the second-generation VMAX's architecture, designed in 2003 and largely frozen since, could not meet without a fundamental and expensive re-engineering of the exhaust system, the engine management, and the fuel delivery. The sales volume had never been large enough to justify that cost. The VMAX was a halo, a statement piece, a motorcycle that drew people into Yamaha showrooms even if they left on something else. But halo machines still have to pass the same tests as everything else on the production line, and the VMAX could not. European production ended after 2016. The last VMAX rolled off the assembly line in Iwata in August 2017. In North America, Yamaha continued selling existing inventory through the Star Motorcycles division, and the final units carried a 2020 model year designation and a retail price of $17,990. But no new VMAXs were being built. The line was cold. Yamaha's official announcement when it came was 4 sentences of corporate language. With deep consideration of evolving global market trends and regulations that limit production volumes on certain models, the following Yamaha models will be discontinued after model year 2020: YZF-R6, VMAX, WER250R, and S-Max. The VMAX shared a death notice with a 250 cubic centimeter trail bike and a scooter. 35 years of the most single-minded motorcycle ever mass-produced, compressed into a press release and a list. You can read the VMAX's end 2 ways, and honest history holds both. One reading says, Yamaha killed a legend through neglect. 23 years without a meaningful redesign on the first generation. A second generation that arrived overweight, overpriced, and into a market that had learned how to build power without punishment. A company that watched the emissions calendar approach for years and chose not to invest in compliance because the sales numbers could not justify the engineering hours. The other reading says the VMAX died of its own philosophy. The concept, maximum straight-line power at the expense of handling, weight, fuel capacity, and versatility, was always going to age out of a regulatory and cultural environment that demanded efficiency, flexibility, and compromise. A motorcycle built to do one thing supremely well is magnificent until the world decides that one thing is no longer enough. A 2014 patent filing showed that Yamaha engineers had explored a cleaner running version of the VMAX engine, fitted with additional catalytic converters and revised exhaust routing. The motorcycle described in that patent never reached production. Whether Yamaha could not save the VMAX or simply chose not to is a question the documented record does not fully answer, and honesty requires that flag. What the regulation killed, the riders refused to bury. The VMAX was never acquired by another company. It was never merged into a different platform. It was never stripped for parts and sold under a different name. But Yamaha moved on in its own quiet way. The VMAX name was transferred to the company's outboard marine engine division, where it now appears on boat motors. The motorcycle that was conceived on a Mississippi bridge, watching illegal drag races, ended its commercial life as a brand on a powerboat engine. There were no limited farewell editions, no special colorways, no press events. The production line simply stopped, and Yamaha said nothing more about it. The competitors' fates frame what the VMAX was. Honda's V65 Magna was discontinued in 1986, 1 year after the VMAX arrived. Suzuki's Madura lasted 3 production years. Kawasaki's Eliminator was eventually revived decades later as an entirely different motorcycle, bearing no mechanical relationship to the original. The Ducati Diavel survived and evolved into successive generations. Only the VMAX held its ground for 35 years without becoming something other than what it was at birth. It was never softened. It was never given a fairing. It was never repositioned as a sport tour or an adventure bike or a commuter. It was born as a straight-line weapon, and it died as a straight-line weapon. And only the VMAX died without a successor. The value math tells the rest of the story. The 1985 original, sold new for $5,299, now commands 5,000 to 7,000 British pounds for a clean, running example, with show-quality machines pushing beyond that. The second generation, retailing at $17,990, holds its value in the used market with a stubbornness that few discontinued Japanese motorcycles can match. The VMAX gained worth in death because the thing it offered, that V-boost shove, that mechanical directness, that uncompromising commitment to one sensation, is something the modern motorcycle industry has neither the regulatory freedom nor the philosophical appetite to replicate. The machines are still out there. In sheds and garages across 3 continents, first-generation VMAXs sit with their fuel tanks hidden beneath their seats and their V-boost servos waiting to click open at 6,000 RPM. The shaft drive and the relatively simple electronics of the original mean that a well-maintained Gen 1 will run for decades, and the forums prove it. VMX Forum, VMX Chat, V4 Muscle Bike Forum. These are not nostalgia clubs. They are working registries where owners share V-boost servo rebuilds, carburetor synchronization procedures, and photographs of barn finds that start on the second kick after years of sitting in the dark. Clubs run from Paris to Sydney to Osaka. Riders bolt aftermarket fork braces onto 30-year-old steel frames and commute on them daily, past riders on machines with 10 times the electronic sophistication and none of the sensation. Nobody who has owned a VMAX describes it the way you describe a motorcycle. They describe it the way you describe a moment. The first time the V-boost opened. The first time the tachometer crossed 6,000 and the servo clicked and the paired carburetors linked and the engine stopped being polite and started being honest. The shove. The horizon pulling forward. Riders do not hold on to machines with marginal brakes and frame flex and a 100-mile fuel range because the specifications justify it. They hold on because the machine did something to them that nothing in a showroom full of modern superbikes, with their traction control and their 6-axis inertial measurement units and their 200 horsepower delivered through ride-by-wire with 17 selectable maps, has ever been able to replicate. The VMAX was always more feeling than machine. That is why the collector values hold. That is why the forums have not gone quiet. That is why, 4 decades after Akira Araki watched 2 motorcycles race across a bridge over the Mississippi, the machines he built from that memory are still running. The fuel tank is still beneath the seat. 4 gallons hidden because the engine demanded the space above it. Every other motorcycle put the fuel where you would expect to find it. The VMAX buried it because the straight line came first, and the straight line always came first. Yamaha took a touring engine out of a 717-pound cruiser, engineered one system of butterfly valves and servo motors, and created a motorcycle that made the world flinch. Then they let it go when the regulations demanded a compromise the machine was never designed to make. It was born going straight, and it died because the road finally turned. If you have ever twisted the throttle on a VMAX past 6,000 RPM and felt the V-boost open, drop a comment below. Tell us the year, the generation, and whether it still runs. The riders who lived with these machines know what was lost better than anyone who sold them. Subscribe to stay with us, because this archive is built one machine at a time, and every story here was written for the people who actually turned the wrenches. We have the story of another engine that outlived the company that built it coming next, and you will not want to miss